Imagine a place where the sky is permanently bruised by smoke and the very earth beneath your feet has been rearranged by the hands of giants. By the start of 1916, the Great War had become a scar across the face of Europe that refused to heal. From the cold waves of the North Sea down to the jagged peaks of the Swiss border, a jagged line of trenches cut through the landscape like a deep, infected wound. Millions of men lived like animals in the mud, hiding in narrow ditches while the world above them was shredded by iron. For over a year these lines had barely moved despite the loss of countless lives. The war had become a stalemate, a frozen moment in time where progress was measured in inches and paid for in blood. This was the grim reality of the Western Front, a landscape of barbed wire and despair where the only thing that grew was the number of graves. In a quiet, dimly lit command bunker, German General Erich von Falkenhayn stood over a massive map of France, his gloved hand tracing the lines of the front with a cold, clinical precision. He was a man who saw war not as a series of heroic charges, but as a mathematical problem of exhaustion. Falkenhayn knew that a traditional breakthrough was nearly impossible against modern machine guns, so he devised a plan that was as brilliant as it was terrifying. He didn't want to capture a city or win a single battle. He wanted to create a mill that would continuously grind the French army into dust. He looked at the map and circled a small, historic town called Verdun. His goal was to attack a target so precious to French pride that they would be forced to defend it with every last man they had. He famously promised to bleed France white, betting that the French would run out of soldiers before the Germans ran out of shells. Verdun was more than just a dot on a map. It was a fortress city that stood as a sentinel for the soul of France. Nestled in a valley and surrounded by a formidable ring of massive underground concrete forts, it was considered by many to be invincible. These forts, like Douaumont and Vaux, were engineering marvels, buried deep within the hillsides and bristling with heavy guns that could sweep the landscape for miles. To the French people, Verdun was a symbol of national resilience, a gateway to Paris that could never be allowed to fall. However, as 1916 began, the area was strangely quiet. The French High Command, believing the main fight would happen elsewhere, had begun to strip the forts of their guns and men. They saw Verdun as a secondary sector, a place of peace in a world of war, unaware that the German mill was already being assembled just beyond the horizon. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the peace of the Verdun Valley was shattered forever by a storm of steel that defied human imagination. At exactly 7:15 a.m., 1,200 German cannons opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a 10-hour bombardment that turned the dawn sky into a flickering wall of flame. Over 1 million shells rained down on a narrow strip of French territory, a concentrated deluge of explosives meant to pulverize everything in its path. The sound was a continuous, rhythmic thumping that could be heard over 100 miles away, vibrating in the chests of people far from the front. In the French lines, the earth didn't just shake, it boiled. Forested hills were turned into fields of splinters, and the very topography of the land was reshaped as thousands of tons of explosives tore into the soil. It was the most intense artillery barrage in history, a terrifying introduction to the industrial-scale slaughter that was about to begin. When the massive guns finally went silent, a new kind of terror emerged from the smoke. As the German infantry surged forward across the cratered wasteland, they carried with them a weapon that seemed to come from the depths of a nightmare, the flamethrower. French survivors, dazed and buried alive in their shattered trenches, looked up to see walls of orange liquid fire roaring toward them. The smell of gasoline and burning earth filled the air as the Germans cleared out the remaining pockets of resistance with literal jets of flame. This was no longer a war of chivalry or even of traditional marksmanship. It was a war of technology designed to incinerate. The French defenders, many of them shell-shocked and unable to hear after the hours of bombardment, found themselves fighting for their lives against a faceless enemy that moved through the haze like ghosts in the fire. Among the ruins of the front lines, a young French soldier sat in a shallow crater, his uniform a mess of gray mud and his face a mask of white dust. He was one of the few who had survived the initial storm, but the man who had entered the trench that morning was gone. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at a world that no longer made sense. Around him, the landscape was unrecognizable. The familiar trees and landmarks had been erased, replaced by a gray moonscape of overlapping holes. He could hear the distant screams of his comrades and the mechanical clatter of machine guns, but he remained motionless, gripped by a paralysis of the soul. This was the face of the Verdun shock, a psychological trauma so deep that men often forgot their own names or how to speak. They were the first victims of the mill, processed by the machinery of war before they had even fired a single shot. On February 25th, the unthinkable occurred, sending a wave of horror through the French nation. Fort Douaumont, the strongest and most imposing fortress in the world, fell to the Germans with almost no resistance. Because the French had neglected the fort's defenses, a small party of German soldiers, led by Sergeant Kuhns, simply wandered up to the massive concrete walls. They found an unmanned gun embrasure and climbed inside, discovering a skeleton crew of French regulars who were completely unaware that the Germans were even near the fort. Without a single shot being fired in a major battle, the invincible anchor of the Verdun line was captured. The news was a catastrophic blow to French morale. It felt as though the very heart of their defense had been ripped out. For the Germans, it was a propaganda triumph. But for the French, it was a signal that the battle for survival had truly begun. In the wake of the disaster at Douaumont, the French government knew they needed a leader who could restore order to the chaos. They chose General Philippe Pétain, a man known for his calm demeanor and his deep concern for the lives of his men. Unlike many other generals of the era who saw soldiers as expendable resources, Pétain understood that morale was the most important weapon on the battlefield. When he arrived at his new headquarters, he looked out at the broken remnants of his army and made a simple, firm vow: they shall not pass. He was a master of logistics and a pioneer of defensive warfare, realizing that the only way to beat the German mill was to turn the French defense into an unbreakable wall. Pétain's presence immediately changed the atmosphere. He brought a sense of grim determination to a front that had been teetering on the edge of total collapse. Pétain's first great challenge was keeping the army alive, as Verdun was nearly cut off from the rest of France. There was only one narrow secondary road leading into the city, and if it were blocked, the French defenders would starve or run out of ammunition within days. Pétain transformed this simple dirt track into a lifeline of unprecedented scale. He organized thousands of trucks to move in a continuous, never-ending loop 24 hours a day. If a truck broke down, it was immediately pushed into the ditch to keep the traffic flowing. There was no time for repairs on the road itself. This single artery, which came to be known as the Voie Sacrée or the Sacred Way, carried 90,000 men and 50,000 tons of supplies every single week. It was a masterpiece of organization that proved that the war would be won as much by the driver and the mechanic as by the man with the rifle. To prevent his men from being completely broken by the horrors of the front, Pétain introduced the Noria system, named after a type of water wheel. In most battles, a division would stay in the line until it was almost entirely destroyed, but Pétain began rotating his units in and out of the furnace every few days. This meant that while nearly every soldier in the French army would eventually have to face the nightmare of Verdun, they would only have to endure it for a short time before being sent to the rear to recover. This system distributed the trauma across the entire nation, creating a shared experience that would define a generation of Frenchmen. It also meant that the Germans were always facing fresh, motivated troops rather than exhausted, starving survivors. The mill was still grinding, but Pétain was ensuring that the machinery of the French army didn't seize up under the pressure. As the spring rains arrived, the battlefield of Verdun transformed into a landscape of liquid misery. The constant shelling had destroyed the natural drainage of the land, turning the cratered earth into a sea of thick, stinking mud that reached up to a man's waist. Soldiers lived in a world where everything was wet, cold, and coated in filth. In this environment, the rats became the masters of the trenches, growing huge and bold as they fed on the unburied dead. The men were plagued by lice and trench foot, a horrific condition where the skin literally began to rot off the bone due to constant immersion in water. It was a life of primitive endurance where the greatest enemy wasn't the German soldier across the way, but the environment itself. The soldiers began to feel less like warriors and more like ghosts inhabiting a drowned and dying world. Shelter became a luxury that few could afford, as the trenches were often nothing more than a series of disconnected shell holes filled with freezing water. In these holes, groups of soldiers would huddle together for warmth, their bodies pressed against one another as the rain turned the sky into a sheet of lead. They ate cold food from tins, often shared with the swarms of flies that thrived in the summer heat, and they slept in short, fitful bursts between artillery barrages. There was no such thing as dry or clean anymore. Every breath was heavy with the scent of cordite, stagnant water, and the sweet, sickly smell of decay that hung over the entire valley. In the silence between the explosions, the only sound was the drip of water and the low moans of men who had reached the absolute limit of what the human spirit could endure. By June, the focus of the German assault shifted to Fort Vaux, a smaller but equally vital fortress. Inside the dark, narrow concrete tunnels of the fort, a few hundred French soldiers were trapped in a claustrophobic hell. The Germans had reached the roof of the fort and were firing flamethrowers and poison gas down into the ventilation shafts. Inside, the air became a toxic soup of smoke and chemicals, forcing the men to wear their primitive gas masks for hours on end. The lights had failed, leaving the defenders to fight by the flickering glow of lanterns in tunnels that were slick with blood and condensation. They were cut off from the world, surrounded on all sides, and facing an enemy that was determined to burn them out of their hole. It was a battle fought in the dark, where the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on the survivors. The most desperate struggle inside Fort Vaux was not against the Germans but against thirst. The fort's water cisterns had been cracked by the heavy shelling, and the men were reduced to a few drops of water a day in the stifling heat of the underground tunnels. Major Raynal, the fort's commander, knew he had to let the outside world know of their plight. He took his last carrier pigeon, a bird named the Brave, and attached a final heartbreaking message to its leg. "We are still holding on, but we are being attacked by gas and fumes. This is my last pigeon." He released the bird through a small opening into a sky filled with poison gas and shrapnel. Against all odds, the pigeon flew through the haze and delivered the message before dying of gas poisoning. Though the pigeon was later awarded the Legion of Honor, no relief could reach the fort. The men held out until they were forced to lick the slime off the walls to survive, eventually surrendering with a dignity that moved even their German captors. Outside the forts, the landscape was dominated by a height known as Le Mort or Dead Man's Hill. This piece of high ground was the key to the entire western bank of the Meuse River, and both sides were willing to sacrifice everything to hold it. The hill was subjected to such a continuous and violent rain of shells that its very shape began to change. Over the course of the battle, the top of the hill was literally pulverized into dust, and the official maps had to be redrawn because the summit was now several meters lower than it had been in February. It was a place where the earth was made of more iron than soil, a barren mound of gray dust where not a single blade of grass remained. The name Dead Man's Hill became a literal description of a place where thousands of lives were traded for a few yards of a disappearing summit. The fighting on the slopes of these hills often devolved into a brutal, primitive struggle that bypassed the technology of the 20th century. When the artillery stopped, the men would climb out of their holes and meet in the middle of the craters for hand-to-hand combat. In the swirling smoke and chaos, they fought with bayonets, knives, shovels, and even their bare hands. It was a visceral, personal form of violence that left the survivors haunted for the rest of their lives. There was no room for mercy in the mud of Verdun. It was a kill-or-be-killed environment where the screams of the wounded were often drowned out by the next incoming shell. These charges rarely resulted in any significant gain, usually ending with both sides retreating to their original holes, leaving a new layer of bodies to be swallowed by the mud. In the pockets of the fallen and in the hands of the living were the journals and letters that told the true story of the battle. One soldier wrote in his diary, "You eat next to the dead, you sleep next to the dead, and eventually you become the dead." These small books, often stained with mud and blood, captured the transition from patriotism to a hollow mechanical sense of duty. The men wrote to their wives and mothers, describing a world that those at home could never truly understand. They spoke of the eternal noise and the longing for a single moment of silence. These journals, lying discarded in the muck next to dented helmets and broken rifles, are the most honest monuments to Verdun. They remind us that behind the grand strategies of generals were hundreds of thousands of individual stories, each ending in a silence that still echoes through history. By July 1916, the German Mail was beginning to falter as the pressure of the global war shifted. To the north, the British launched a massive offensive at the River Somme, a move designed specifically to draw German resources away from the slaughter at Verdun. At the same time, a massive Russian offensive in the east forced the German High Command to pull divisions and heavy guns away from the Western Front to prevent a collapse in the Orient. Suddenly Falkenhayn's plan was falling apart. He had wanted to bleed France white, but he had underestimated the resilience of the French and the sheer scale of the conflict. Germany was now the one being bled, caught in a war on two fronts that was draining its manpower and industrial strength. The mill had finally met a force it couldn't grind down, the combined weight of the Allied world. With the German pressure easing, the French army prepared to move from the defensive to the offensive. A new general, Charles Mangin, took charge of the counterattacks. Mangin was a man of fierce aggression, earned the nickname, the Butcher, for his willingness to accept high casualties in exchange for victory. He believed that the only way to end the nightmare was to drive the Germans back through sheer force of will. He gathered a massive concentration of artillery and fresh colonial troops, preparing to retake the ground that had been lost over the previous 6 months. The French soldiers who had spent months huddled in holes were now told it was their turn to charge. There was a grim sense of purpose in the ranks. They wanted to reclaim the forts and end the long, bloody summer of 1916 on their own terms. The French counteroffensive featured a revolutionary new tactic, the creeping barrage. This required a level of precision that had never before been achieved in warfare. The French artillery would fire a wall of shells that landed just 50 yards in front of their own advancing infantry. As the soldiers walked forward, the artillery crept forward with them, timed to the second. If the infantry moved too slow, they would miss the window of opportunity. If they moved too fast, they would be killed by their own guns. This wall of fire acted as a shield, keeping the German defenders pinned in their dugouts until the French were right on top of them. It was a sophisticated dance of death that showed how much the French had learned during their months in the furnace. In October 1916, the creeping barrage led the French back to the walls of Fort Douaumont. This time the French were the ones surging through the broken concrete and reclaiming the heights. When the French flag was finally raised over the scarred roof of the fort, it was a moment of profound national catharsis. The capture of Douaumont by the Germans had marked the beginning of the crisis, and its recapture marked the beginning of the end. A few weeks later, Fort Vaux was also retaken. The Germans, exhausted and depleted, were forced to retreat from the positions they had spent hundreds of thousands of lives to win. The mill had finally stopped turning, and the French had proven that they could not only endure but overcome the greatest trial in their history. When the guns finally went silent on December 18, 1916, the landscape they left behind was unrecognizable as a part of the earth. The Verdun Valley had been transformed into a red zone, a place so poisoned by chemicals and filled with unexploded shells that it was declared unfit for human life. The forests were gone, replaced by a gray, undulating sea of craters that looked like a frozen ocean. There were no birds, no trees, and no buildings, only the jagged remains of a world that had been pulverized for 303 days. 9 entire villages had been so completely erased from existence that they were never rebuilt. Today they exist only as names on signs in the woods. It was a landscape of total destruction, a physical manifestation of the madness that had gripped the world for nearly a year. In the aftermath, the focus shifted from killing to healing, though the wounds were deep. Field hospitals were overwhelmed by the survivors, men who had lost limbs, sight, or their sanity. Thousands of soldiers suffered from disfigurement, their faces shattered by shrapnel in a way that made them outcasts in their own society. The medical personnel worked tirelessly in tents and ruined buildings, but they could not heal the psychological scars of the furnace. The veterans of Verdun would carry the battle with them for the rest of their lives, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of phantom shells and the smell of the mud. The victory was real, but it was a victory of the broken, a triumph that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. The individual toll of the battle was marked by hundreds of thousands of simple wooden crosses that began to sprout from the mud. Often, these graves were nothing more than a helmet resting on a piece of wood, marked with a name or simply the word "and canoe," unknown. For every soldier who received a proper burial, another was simply swallowed by the earth, his remains mixed forever with the soil of the valley. These temporary cemeteries stretched as far as the eye could see, a silent army of the dead that outnumbered the living who remained. As the families of the fallen began to visit the battlefield, they found a place of profound silence, a sharp contrast to the 10 months of thunder that had preceded it. The war had moved on, but Verdun would forever belong to the men who stayed behind. Today the Battle of Verdun is remembered through the massive Douaumont ossuary, a building that houses the bones of 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers. Looking through the small windows at the base of the monument, you can see the literal piles of bones, a haunting reminder of the mill that ground human beings into statistics. Surrounding the ossuary is a cemetery of 16,000 white crosses, a fraction of the total loss. Verdun stands as a warning to the future, a testament to the fact that when industrial power is turned toward destruction, the result is a hole in history that can never be filled. It is a story of incredible courage and unimaginable suffering, a place where the human spirit was tested to its absolute breaking point. The echoes of "They shall not pass" still linger in the wind of the valley, a final tribute to the generation that stood its ground in the heart of the furnace.